Picture this: 2.3 million blocks of stone, each one weighing about 2.5 tons on average, some weighing as much as 70 tons, all stacked together to form the Great Pyramid of Giza, one of the most perfect structures ever built by human hands. Now here is where it gets weird. According to mainstream history, this entire thing was constructed in just 20 years during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu, around 2560 BC. Let me break down what that actually means. If you do the math, building the Great Pyramid in 20 years means the ancient Egyptians had to quarry, transport, and precisely place one block every 5 minutes, every single day, for 2 decades straight. No weekends off, no holidays, no stopping when workers got sick or when the Nile flooded. Just block after block after block, fitted together so perfectly that you cannot slide a credit card between most of them. And we are not talking about dropping rocks in a pile. Each block had to be cut with extreme precision, hauled across the desert or shipped down the Nile, then lifted into place and aligned with mathematical accuracy that would make modern engineers jealous. The entire structure is aligned to true north with an error of only 3/60ths of a single degree. That is more accurate than the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, England was when it was first built in 1675. Let that sink in for a moment. Now, if you are thinking, well, maybe they just had a lot of workers and really good organization, let me tell you about something that happened in 1978. A Japanese team, armed with all of our modern knowledge, power tools, computer calculations, and engineering expertise, decided to build a small-scale pyramid using ancient Egyptian techniques. They wanted to prove it could be done. They failed. Completely. They could not even move the massive stones using the methods historians claim the Egyptians used. Eventually, they gave up and brought in bulldozers and cranes just to finish their tiny replica. Think about that. We, with all our technology, with everything we know about physics and engineering, with machinery that can lift hundreds of tons, we could not replicate what supposedly happened 4,500 years ago, with nothing but copper tools, wooden sledges, and rope made from papyrus. But it gets stranger. The ancient Egyptians, at the time the pyramids were allegedly built, did not have the wheel for transportation. They did not have iron tools. They did not have pulleys as we know them. They did not even have horses yet. And somehow, they managed to cut, move, and stack millions of blocks of limestone and granite into a structure that remained the tallest building on Earth for 3,800 years. The granite blocks inside the king's chamber? Those came from Aswan, over 500 miles away, in an era before trucks, trains, or even proper roads. Each granite block weighs up to 80 tons, that is 160,000 pounds, per block. And they lifted these blocks over 200 feet in the air and placed them with such precision that the corners of the chamber are still perfectly square after more than 4,000 years. So here's the question nobody wants to ask out loud. What if everything we have been told about how the pyramids were built is wrong? What if the story we learned in school, the one about ramps and slaves and copper chisels, is not just incomplete but fundamentally flawed? Before we go any further, I want to take just a moment here. If you are intrigued by these kinds of mysteries, the stories that history books gloss over or get wrong, you are in the right place. This is Tales Before Tesla, where we dig into the real stories behind the world's greatest enigmas. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you do not miss what we are about to uncover. Because trust me, what we are going to explore today will change the way you think about ancient history forever. Now, back to our impossible structure. The Great Pyramid is not just big and old. It is mathematically sophisticated in ways that should not be possible for its time. The ratio of its perimeter to its height is 2 times pi, the same ratio you find when you divide the circumference of a circle by its radius. Was that intentional? Did the ancient Egyptians know about pi thousands of years before the Greeks supposedly discovered it? And that is just the beginning. The deeper you look at the Great Pyramid, the more questions pile up. Questions that demand answers. Questions that make you wonder if maybe, just maybe, there is a true story here that we have not been told. So we have established that the Great Pyramid should not exist, at least not according to what we know about ancient Egyptian technology. But here is where things get even more complicated. What if the pyramid is not even from the time period we think it is? What if it is far, far older than mainstream archaeology wants to admit? Let me introduce you to a geologist named Robert Schoch. He is a professor at Boston University, a legitimate scientist with credentials that nobody can question. In the early 1990s, Schoch did something that most Egyptologists refused to do. He looked at the Sphinx and the structures around the Giza Plateau not as an archaeologist, but as a geologist. And what he found shook the entire field of Egyptology to its core. Schoch noticed something strange about the weathering patterns on the Sphinx and the walls of its enclosure. The erosion was not wind erosion, which is what you would expect in the middle of a desert. It was water erosion, deep, vertical channels carved by heavy rainfall over thousands of years. But here's the problem. The Sahara has been a desert for the last 5,000 years. The last time the Giza Plateau experienced that kind of sustained, heavy rainfall was at the end of the last ice age, somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000 years ago. When Schoch published his findings, the Egyptology establishment went ballistic. They called him a pseudoscientist. They said he was promoting fringe theories. But here is the thing. Schoch is not some conspiracy theorist making wild claims on the internet. He is a geologist who looked at rocks and water erosion patterns, something geologists do every single day. And his conclusion was simple. Based on the erosion evidence, the Sphinx and possibly the pyramids or their foundations could be thousands of years older than we have been told. Now, if that is true, we have a massive problem, because according to conventional history, there was no advanced civilization on Earth 10,000 years ago. Humans were supposed to be living in small hunter-gatherer tribes, barely figuring out agriculture. They were not supposed to be building massive stone monuments with mathematical precision and astronomical alignments. But let us talk about those astronomical alignments for a moment, because this is where things get really interesting. The three pyramids of Giza, the Great Pyramid, the Pyramid of Khafre, and the Pyramid of Menkaure, are not randomly placed. When you look at them from above, their layout mirrors the three stars of Orion's belt, almost perfectly. Now, you might think, okay, that is cool, but maybe it is just a coincidence. Except it is not just the layout. The pyramid's alignment to Orion's belt corresponds to how those stars appeared in the sky around 10,500 BC, not 2,500 BC when they were supposedly built. This theory was popularized by Robert Bauval in what is called the Orion correlation theory, and while it is controversial, the mathematical correlation is undeniable. Then there is the alignment to true north. The Great Pyramid is aligned to true north with an accuracy of 3/60ths of 1 degree. To put that in perspective, the Paris Observatory, built in 1667 with telescopes and advanced mathematical knowledge, has an error of 6 minutes of arc. The Great Pyramid is twice as accurate. How did ancient Egyptians, supposedly working with primitive tools and no advanced astronomical instruments, achieve this level of precision? And it is not just about having good tools. To align something to true north with that kind of accuracy, you need to understand the rotation of the Earth. You need to track the stars over long periods of time. You need mathematical calculations that, according to our history books, should not have existed yet. Here is another thing that does not make sense. The Great Pyramid appears suddenly in Egyptian history, with no clear evolutionary development. Think about how technology usually develops. You start with something simple, you make mistakes, you learn, you improve, and eventually you get to something sophisticated. That is how progress works. But with the pyramids, we do not see that pattern. The pyramids that came before Giza? Much simpler. Cruder construction, less precise. Then suddenly, boom, we get the Great Pyramid. Perfect angles, perfect alignment, construction techniques so advanced that we still debate how they did it. And here is the kicker. The pyramids that came after Giza, they are actually worse. Less precise, cruder construction. Some of them have even collapsed. It is like if you looked at the history of airplanes and found that the Wright brothers' first flight was a jumbo jet, and then 50 years later people were building biplanes that barely got off the ground. It does not make sense. Technology does not work backwards like that. This has led some researchers to propose something radical. What if the Great Pyramid was not built by the ancient Egyptians we know from history? What if it was built by an earlier, more advanced civilization, and the Egyptians of Khufu's time simply inherited it, maintained it, or claimed it as their own? I know what you are thinking. That sounds like fringe conspiracy theory territory. But hold on. Let us look at what the ancient Egyptians themselves said. There are references in ancient texts to something called the Zep Tepi, which translates to the first time. It describes an era when gods walked among men and great works were accomplished. Egyptian priests told the Greek historian Herodotus that their civilization's history stretched back far beyond what we give them credit for. Some ancient Egyptian king lists mention dynasties that ruled for thousands of years before the first pharaoh we officially recognize. Now, are these just myths? Maybe. But what if they are not? What if they are garbled memories of something real? A civilization that existed before the Egypt we know? One that possessed knowledge and technology that was later lost? And here is where it gets really uncomfortable for mainstream archaeology. We keep finding evidence that does not fit the timeline. In Turkey, there is a site called Göbekli Tepe, a massive temple complex with precisely carved stone pillars arranged in circles. It was built around 9600 BC, that is 11,600 years ago, by hunter-gatherers. At least, that is what we are told. But hunter-gatherers are not supposed to have the organization, the manpower, or the knowledge to build something like that. If people were building sophisticated stone structures 11,000 years ago in Turkey, why is it so crazy to think they might have been doing the same thing in Egypt? Maybe the Great Pyramid is not 4,500 years old. Maybe it is twice that. Maybe even older. The conventional dating of the pyramids relies heavily on two things. First, the historical records attributing them to specific pharaohs. Second, organic materials found in and around the pyramids that have been carbon dated. But here is the problem with that. Just because organic material from Khufu's time was found in the pyramid does not mean that is when it was built. It could mean that is when it was renovated, maintained, or repurposed. Imagine if, thousands of years from now, archaeologists find a McDonald's wrapper inside Stonehenge and conclude that Stonehenge was built in 1995. That is essentially what we might be doing with the pyramids. We are dating the maintenance work, not the original construction. And nobody wants to talk about the fact that the ancient Egyptians themselves never actually claimed to have built the pyramids, not in the way we think. There are no detailed records from the Old Kingdom describing the construction process, no blueprints, no worker logs detailing the day-to-day progress, nothing that you would expect from a project of this magnitude. The attribution to Khufu comes largely from later sources and from graffiti marks found inside the pyramid, which some researchers argue could have been added later. What we are left with is a structure that is too precise for its time, aligned to stars in a way that points to a much earlier date, made with techniques we cannot replicate, and surrounded by weathering evidence that suggests it might be thousands of years older than we have been told. And the civilization that supposedly built it left no clear instructions, no evolutionary trail of development, and no explanation for how they achieved what should have been impossible. So the question is not just, how was the Great Pyramid built? The question is, when was it really built, and by whom? Because the more we look at the evidence, the more it seems like the story we have been told is not the whole truth. And if we are wrong about when it was built, then everything else we think we know about ancient history might need to be rewritten. Before we go further, I am curious. Where are you watching this from right now? Are you in New York, where it is early morning? Maybe London in the afternoon? Or perhaps you are on the other side of the world in Sydney, where the sun is already setting? Drop your location and your local time in the comments. I love seeing how these ancient mysteries bring people together from every corner of the globe, all of us asking the same questions across different time zones. It is kind of fitting, actually, considering we are talking about a structure that has been connecting humanity across time for 45 centuries. Now, let us talk about what mainstream archaeology says happened, and where their explanation starts to crack under pressure. Alright, let us be fair here. Before we dive deeper into alternative theories and unexplained mysteries, we need to talk about what mainstream archaeology actually says. Because believe it or not, there is real evidence supporting the conventional story, and ignoring it would make us just as guilty of cherry-picking facts as anyone else. So, here is the official narrative. The Great Pyramid was built around 2560 BC as a tomb for Pharaoh Khufu, also known by his Greek name, Cheops. It took roughly 20 years to complete and required a workforce of around 100,000 laborers, though some modern estimates put that number closer to 20,000 to 30,000 workers rotating in shifts. These were not slaves, by the way. That is a common misconception that Hollywood loves to perpetuate. The workers were paid laborers, probably conscripted during the flood season when farming was impossible. They received food, beer, and shelter. We know this because archaeologists have actually found their village. In the 1980s and 90s, teams led by Mark Lehner and Zahi Hawass uncovered an entire workers' settlement near the Giza Plateau, complete with bakeries, copper workshops, and even a medical facility with evidence of healed bones, suggesting workers received health care. They also found the workers' cemetery. The people buried there were not royalty, but they were not treated like disposable slaves either. Some tombs show signs of honor and respect. The skeletons show evidence of hard physical labor, but also adequate nutrition. They were eating meat regularly, which was a luxury in ancient Egypt. These were valued workers on a national project, not an enslaved workforce being worked to death. The historical record also mentions the pyramids, though not always in detail. The Greek historian Herodotus visited Egypt around 450 BC and wrote about the pyramids based on what Egyptian priests told him. He described massive ramps, hundreds of thousands of workers, and a construction period of 20 years. While Herodotus was writing 2,000 years after the fact, and some of his details are clearly wrong, his account has been the foundation of the traditional theory for centuries. Now, how did they actually build it, according to mainstream theory? The process goes something like this. Limestone blocks were quarried locally from the Giza Plateau itself. Workers used copper chisels, wooden wedges, and pounding stones made of dolerite, a harder stone that could shape limestone. They would cut channels around a block, drive in wooden wedges, soak the wedges with water to make them expand, and crack the stone free from the bedrock. Once quarried, the blocks were moved on wooden sledges. Recent experiments have shown that wetting the sand in front of the sledge reduces friction dramatically, making it much easier to pull heavy loads. A team of maybe 20 to 30 men could move a 2.5-ton block this way, especially on level ground or slight inclines. For lifting the blocks into place, the prevailing theory involves ramps. Not a single giant ramp going straight up, which would require more material than the pyramid itself, but rather a series of internal ramps, spiral ramps, or a combination system. In 2018, archaeologists actually discovered evidence of a ramp system at an ancient alabaster quarry in the eastern desert. The ramp had steps with post holes on either side, likely used for ropes and sledges, proving the Egyptians did use ramp technology for moving large stones. The copper tools argument also holds more water than skeptics admit. Yes, copper is soft, but copper tools, especially when combined with abrasive sand as a cutting agent, can absolutely cut limestone. Experimental archaeology has proven this repeatedly. As for the harder granite blocks from Aswan, those could be shaped using dolerite pounders in a process that is brutally time-consuming but entirely possible. And let us talk about those granite blocks from Aswan for a second, because the transportation issue is not as impossible as it sounds. The Nile River flows right past both Aswan and Giza. During the annual flood season, the water level rises significantly, sometimes coming within a few hundred feet of the pyramid construction site. The Egyptians were master boat builders and river navigators. Floating 80-ton blocks downstream on large barges is difficult. Sure, but it is not impossible. People moved massive stones by water throughout history, from the ancient world to the construction of European cathedrals. So, on the surface, the mainstream explanation kind of works. There is archaeological evidence of workers. There is historical documentation, even if it is secondhand. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that the proposed techniques are at least theoretically possible. The pieces fit together into a coherent narrative. But here is where the cracks start to show. First, let us talk about those copper tools and limestone blocks. Yes, you can cut limestone with copper and sand. But the Great Pyramid is not just made of rough-cut limestone blocks. The outer casing stones, most of which have been stripped away over the centuries, were cut and polished with incredible precision. We are talking about blocks fitted together so tightly that a razor blade cannot fit between them. The surfaces were smooth and angled precisely to create the pyramid's perfect slope. Some surviving casing stones show tolerances of 1/50th of an inch across massive surfaces. That level of precision is not something you achieve by pounding away with copper chisels and sand. Modern stonemasons, using diamond-tipped saws and laser-guided measuring tools, would struggle to replicate that consistency across 2.3 million blocks. Then there is the granite problem. Yes, you can theoretically pound granite with dolerite, but the granite blocks in the King's Chamber, the Grand Gallery, and the relieving chambers above, they are not just placed, they are finished. Some have perfectly smooth surfaces. Some show evidence of what looks like machine tooling, perfectly straight lines and 90-degree angles that are extremely difficult to achieve by hand pounding. Inside the King's Chamber, There are granite beams weighing 70 tons each forming the ceiling. These beams are positioned over 200 feet above ground level, fitted precisely in place. The official theory says they used ramps and levers. But let us think about that practically. You have a 70-ton piece of granite. That is 140,000 pounds. You need to lift it 200 feet in the air, maneuver it into position, and lower it gently into place without cracking it or the blocks beneath it, with ropes, wooden levers, and manpower. The margin for error is essentially zero. Engineers today would use computer modeling, hydraulic lifts, and precision cranes for a job like that, and they would still be nervous about it. Here is another issue nobody likes to address. The internal passages and chambers of the Great Pyramid are not crude tunnels. The Grand Gallery, for example, is a corbelled ceiling masterpiece that rises at a precise 26-degree angle for over 150 feet. Each corbel, each stone, is precisely shaped and positioned. There are no test runs, no practice pyramids where they figured this stuff out. The Great Pyramid just appears, fully formed, with these sophisticated internal structures already perfected. And let us revisit the timeline problem with fresh eyes. Even if you accept that the techniques were possible, the logistics are staggering. You are not just placing blocks. You are running a massive supply chain. You need to feed tens of thousands of workers daily. You need copper tools by the thousands, which wear out constantly and need to be replaced or resharpened. You need rope, wood, water, and coordination that would challenge modern project managers with computers and instant communication. One recent study tried to model the workforce requirements more accurately and found that just the logistics of supplying food to the workers would have required a separate army of support staff. The bakeries they found at the workers' village, those would need to operate at industrial scale, producing thousands of loaves daily. Where did all the grain come from? How was it stored? How did they manage quality control? The mainstream explanation works if you look at each piece individually. Workers, check. Tools, check. Techniques, maybe. But when you try to put all the pieces together into a functioning timeline with real-world constraints, the picture gets fuzzy. It is like looking at a jigsaw puzzle where most of the pieces fit, but there are gaps that nobody wants to talk about. Gaps that get filled with phrases like, "we assume" and "they probably," and "it is theoretically possible." None of this means the mainstream theory is wrong, but it does mean it is incomplete. And maybe, just maybe, there are parts of the story we are still missing. Now we are getting into the really interesting territory. The stuff that makes academics uncomfortable and gets researchers labeled as fringe theorists. But here is the thing. Some of these alternative explanations are not coming from random conspiracy theorists on the internet. They are coming from scientists, engineers, and chemists who looked at the evidence and said, "Wait a minute, something does not add up here." Let me tell you about a guy named John Keely. Back in the 1800s, Keely claimed he had discovered a way to use sound vibrations to manipulate matter and even levitate objects. He called it sympathetic vibratory physics. Most people dismissed him as a fraud, and to be fair, he probably was running some kind of scam to attract investors. But here is where it gets weird. Keely actually demonstrated devices that seemed to work, at least sometimes, moving objects and creating effects that witnesses could not explain. When he died in 1898, his workshop was searched, and while some hidden mechanisms were found, many of his demonstrations remained unexplained. Fast forward to the 21st century. NASA and other research institutions have been experimenting with acoustic levitation. They can use sound waves, ultrasonic frequencies specifically, to suspend small objects in midair. The objects literally float, held in place by pressure from sound waves. Now, they are only levitating tiny things, droplets of liquid, small foam balls, nothing even close to multi-ton blocks of stone. But the principle is proven. Sound can manipulate matter. So, here is the question that makes people uncomfortable. What if ancient civilizations understood acoustic principles that we are only now rediscovering? What if they figured out how to use sound, resonance, and vibration to move massive stones in ways we have not figured out yet? Before you dismiss this as fantasy, consider this. Ancient temples around the world show evidence of being built with acoustic properties in mind. The Temple of Karnak in Egypt has chambers that resonate at specific frequencies. Newgrange in Ireland has a passage that amplifies sound in strange ways. The Mayan pyramids at Chichen Itza produce echo effects that sound like a quetzal bird when you clap at the base. These people clearly understood something about acoustics and architecture. There are stories, ancient legends from multiple cultures, about priests or wise men who could move stones by chanting, by using their voices or special instruments. Usually, we write these off as mythology. But what if they are not? What if they are exaggerated memories of real acoustic technology? Coral Castle in Florida is a modern example that makes you think. Between 1923 and 1951, a single man named Edward Leedskalnin, who weighed about 100 pounds, somehow quarried, carved, and moved over 1,000 tons of coral rock. Some individual pieces weigh 30 tons. He worked alone, mostly at night, and refused to let anyone watch him work. When asked how he did it, he talked about understanding the secrets of the pyramids, about magnetism and energy. After his death, people found a flywheel device and some basic tools, but nothing that explains how one small man moved stones that should require cranes and teams of workers. Did Leedskalnin figure out some kind of acoustic or electromagnetic trick? We do not know. But the coral structures are still there, and nobody has fully explained how he built them alone. Now let us talk about something even more controversial, the geopolymer theory. This one comes from a French chemist named Joseph Davidovits. In the 1970s, Davidovits was not thinking about pyramids at all. He was developing modern materials, specifically a type of synthetic stone made from mineral compounds that could be mixed like concrete and cast into shape. He called these geopolymers. One day, he took a closer look at samples from the Great Pyramid and noticed something strange. The limestone blocks, under microscopic analysis, showed properties that did not quite match natural limestone. They contained unusual ratios of certain minerals, air bubbles, and microstructures that looked more like cast material than carved stone. Some blocks showed horizontal lines that resembled pore marks, like you would see in concrete. Davidovits proposed something radical. What if the pyramid blocks were not carved at all? What if they were cast on site using a mixture of limestone rubble, mineral compounds, and water? You would essentially create a slurry, pour it into wooden molds right where you needed the block, let it harden, and boom, you have a perfectly fitted stone without ever having to move it. This would solve so many problems. No need to transport millions of blocks. No need for impossible ramps. The precision fit becomes easy because you are pouring stones into place like concrete. The lack of tool marks makes sense because you are not cutting stone, you are casting it. Even the density variations within single blocks, which geologists have noted, make more sense if the blocks are manufactured rather than natural. Now, the Egyptology community went nuclear over this theory. They attacked Davidovits viciously, called his research flawed, said he was twisting the evidence. But here's the thing. Some of his chemical analysis holds up. Independent researchers have found similar anomalies in pyramid stones. And casting stone is not some crazy modern invention. The ancient Romans made concrete that has lasted 2,000 years and is in some ways superior to modern concrete. We know the technology existed in the ancient world, but if the Egyptians were casting blocks, where is the evidence of the mixing sites? Where are the molds? Where are the ancient texts describing the process? Critics say the lack of this evidence disproves the theory. Supporters say that after 4,500 years, most evidence would have disappeared, and the Egyptians might have kept the technique secret, like a proprietary trade secret. The geopolymer debate is still raging, and honestly, neither side has definitively won. But it raises an important point. There might be construction techniques we have not considered because we are locked into thinking about ancient technology in primitive terms. Speaking of lost technology, let us take a quick detour through history. In 1936, workers in modern-day Iraq discovered something bizarre. A collection of clay jars, about 6 inches tall, containing copper cylinders and iron rods, sealed with asphalt. When researchers tested them, they found that adding an acidic liquid like vinegar or wine turned these jars into primitive batteries. They produced about 1 to 2 volts of electricity. Nobody knows for sure what these Baghdad batteries were used for. Maybe electroplating, maybe some kind of religious ritual, but they prove something crucial. Ancient people were messing around with technology that we assumed did not exist until thousands of years later. Then there is the Antikythera mechanism, found in a shipwreck off the coast of Greece. It is a bronze device with dozens of gears, built around 100 BC, that functioned as an ancient analog computer to predict astronomical positions and eclipses. When it was first X-rayed, scientists could not believe what they were seeing. The complexity of the gearwork was not supposed to exist until the development of mechanical clocks in medieval Europe over 1,000 years later. These discoveries prove that ancient civilizations had knowledge and technology that was lost, sometimes for centuries or millennia. So why is it so hard to believe that the ancient Egyptians might have had construction techniques or scientific knowledge that we have not rediscovered? But now we need to talk about the elephant in the room, the cover-up allegations. And look, I know the moment you say cover-up, people roll their eyes and think tinfoil hats. But let us look at some facts that make people suspicious. The Egyptian government, specifically the Supreme Council of Antiquities, has historically been very restrictive about who can study the pyramids and what kind of research is allowed. Independent researchers often complain about being denied access or having their permits revoked. Why? The official answer is preservation and preventing damage to the monuments, which is totally reasonable. These are priceless, irreplaceable structures. But here is where it gets sketchy. There have been multiple instances of research teams discovering chambers, passages, or anomalies using ground-penetrating radar or other non-invasive technologies, only to have their findings suppressed or dismissed without proper investigation. In 2015, thermal scanning revealed temperature anomalies in the Great Pyramid, suggesting hidden chambers or passages. The Egyptian authorities acknowledged the findings but have been extremely slow to follow up with proper exploration. Then there is the famous story of Edgar Cayce, the so-called sleeping prophet. In the 1930s, while in a trance state, Cayce described a hall of records buried beneath the Sphinx containing the knowledge and history of an advanced prehistoric civilization. He gave specific locations and descriptions. Now, you can believe in psychic predictions or not, that is your call. But here is the interesting part. In the 1990s, researchers using seismic equipment detected a large rectangular chamber beneath the front paws of the Sphinx, right where Cayce said it would be. The Egyptian authorities have refused to excavate. They say it would damage the Sphinx. Maybe that is true, or maybe they know what is down there and do not want to deal with the implications. If you found evidence of a civilization predating ancient Egypt, or technology that should not exist, it would rewrite history books worldwide. Careers built on conventional timelines would crumble. Tourist narratives would need to change. It would be messy. Is there an actual cover-up? Or is it just bureaucratic caution and legitimate concerns about preservation? Honestly, it is hard to say. But the secrecy and restricted access definitely fuel speculation. There is also the matter of artifacts that have mysteriously disappeared or been kept from public view. Researchers have reported finding objects or inscriptions inside the pyramids that do not fit the standard narrative, only to have those objects confiscated or declared off-limits for further study. Some claim to have seen tool marks that suggest advanced machinery, but when they try to photograph or study these marks more closely, access is denied. Again, is this sinister suppression of truth? Or is it just a government protecting its national treasures from over-enthusiastic researchers who might jump to wild conclusions and damage Egypt's reputation as a tourist destination? Both explanations are possible, but here is what makes people really suspicious. The narrative around the pyramids has not changed significantly in over 100 years, despite new technologies, new discoveries, and new evidence that challenges parts of the conventional story. Science is supposed to be self-correcting. New evidence should lead to revised theories. But in Egyptology, certain core beliefs seem almost untouchable. Suggest that the pyramids might be older than officially stated? You are a pseudoscientist. Propose alternative construction methods? You are disrespecting ancient Egyptian achievement. Question the tomb theory because no mummy was ever found in the Great Pyramid. You are ignoring obvious explanations like ancient tomb robbers, even though the pyramid was supposedly sealed and there is no evidence of a break-in that could have removed a mummy. The academic gatekeeping is real. And when academics refuse to seriously consider alternative explanations, even when those explanations are backed by legitimate scientific analysis, people start to wonder what they are protecting. Look, maybe there is no cover-up. Maybe the Egyptian government is just being cautious. Maybe mainstream archaeologists are just following the evidence as they see it. But the secrecy, the restricted access, the dismissal of alternative research without proper investigation, it all creates an environment where conspiracy theories thrive. Because when people feel like they are not being told the whole truth, they start imagining what might be hidden. And honestly, given what we have already talked about, the impossible precision, the unexplained techniques, the anomalies that do not fit the standard timeline, can you really blame people for thinking there might be more to the story than we are being told? Okay, It is time to address the theories that make even open-minded researchers cringe a little. The ones that show up in late-night cable documentaries with dramatic music and lots of CGI. But before we dismiss them outright, let us actually look at what these theories claim, and more importantly, why millions of people find them compelling. Let us start with the big one, ancient aliens. The ancient astronaut theory, popularized by Erich von Däniken in his 1968 book Chariots of the Gods, goes something like this. Extraterrestrial beings visited Earth thousands of years ago and either built the pyramids themselves or gave humans the technology and knowledge to build them. The precision, the mathematical sophistication, the astronomical alignments, all of it points to knowledge that primitive humans could not possibly have possessed on their own. The History Channel's Ancient Aliens series has been running since 2010, exploring this idea across hundreds of episodes. They point to ancient artwork that supposedly depicts spacecraft, ancient texts describing flying vehicles and beings descending from the sky, and the seemingly impossible construction of megalithic sites around the world. The pyramids are always exhibit A in their case. Here is their argument. Look at the pyramid's mathematical properties. The perimeter divided by twice the height gives you pi. The pyramid's location, when you express it in decimal degrees of latitude, matches the speed of light in meters per second. The alignment to true north is more precise than most modern buildings. The three pyramids mirror Orion's belt. Ancient humans, barely out of the Stone Age, did all this by accident? Or did they have help from an advanced intelligence? On the surface, it sounds compelling. And honestly, if you just look at the facts in isolation, the alien explanation seems to answer everything. Advanced knowledge? Aliens taught them. Impossible construction? Alien technology. Sudden appearance of sophisticated architecture? Aliens arrived, shared some knowledge, then left. But here is the problem. There is zero physical evidence. No alien artifacts have been found at Giza. No materials that could not have come from Earth. No technology that requires elements or alloys beyond what ancient humans could produce. Every single stone, every tool fragment, every piece of evidence we have found is completely consistent with terrestrial origin. The ancient alien theory also kind of insults human ingenuity. It assumes that ancient people were too stupid or primitive to figure things out on their own. But humans 4,500 years ago had the same brain capacity we have now. They were just as smart, just as creative, just as capable of innovation. They had less accumulated knowledge, sure, but they were not idiots who needed aliens to show them how to stack rocks. Plus, if aliens came all the way across the galaxy to help humans build monuments, why would they use stone? Why not introduce metal alloys, advanced materials, anything that would make construction easier? Why teach humans to move blocks with ropes and ramps if you have anti-gravity technology? It does not make sense. The ancient alien theory is fun. It makes for great television. But it does not hold up to scrutiny. It explains the mysteries by introducing an even bigger mystery that we have no evidence for. Now let us talk about Atlantis. The Atlantis theory has serious historical roots. Plato wrote about it in 360 BC, describing an advanced island civilization that sank beneath the waves around 9600 BC. For centuries, people have searched for Atlantis, convinced it was a real place. Some researchers, including Edgar Cayce, claimed that survivors of Atlantis escaped before the cataclysm and brought their advanced knowledge to other parts of the world, including Egypt. According to this theory, the survivors were the ones who designed and possibly built the pyramids, or at least taught the Egyptians how to do it. This would explain the sudden appearance of advanced architecture and the sophisticated knowledge encoded in the pyramid's design. The appeal of this theory is obvious. It solves the timeline problem. If the pyramid builders had knowledge from an earlier advanced civilization, that explains the mathematical sophistication, the astronomical alignments, all of it. It also fits with myths from around the world about a great flood and lost civilizations, suggesting there might be some historical truth buried in these stories. But here is the reality check. We have explored a lot of the ocean floor, especially in the Mediterranean where Plato placed Atlantis. We have not found any evidence of a sunken advanced civilization. No ruins, no artifacts, nothing that suggests a Bronze Age level society, let alone something more advanced, existed and then disappeared beneath the waves. Plato himself might have been writing allegory, not history. Many scholars believe Atlantis was a fictional device he used to make philosophical points about hubris and the rise and fall of civilizations. There is debate about whether he even intended for people to take it literally. That said, the Atlantis theory is not completely crazy. We know that sea levels rose dramatically at the end of the last ice age. Coastal settlements were definitely flooded and lost. Doggerland, a land bridge that connected Britain to continental Europe, was submerged around 6500 BC. Entire landscapes disappeared underwater, and any civilizations living there would have been wiped out or displaced. So could there have been an advanced coastal civilization that was destroyed by rising seas and whose survivors spread out, carrying their knowledge to places like Egypt? It is possible in the abstract, but without physical evidence, it remains speculation. Now we get to the theory that has the most scientific backing, even though it is still considered fringe by mainstream archaeology. The advanced ancient civilization theory, championed by researchers like Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson. This theory does not invoke aliens or mythical continents. Instead, it suggests that there was a sophisticated human civilization during the last ice age, roughly 12,000 to 15,000 years ago, that was largely wiped out by a global catastrophe. The survivors scattered, taking fragments of their knowledge to different parts of the world, where they influenced the development of later civilizations, like ancient Egypt. The key piece of evidence here is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Around 12,800 years ago, Earth's climate suddenly plunged back into Ice Age conditions for about 1,000 years. This happened incredibly rapidly, in geological terms almost overnight. For decades, scientists could not figure out why. Recent research has found evidence of meteor impacts or airbursts around this time. A comet or asteroid may have broken up and impacted Earth in multiple locations, causing massive fires, tsunamis, and a climate catastrophe that wiped out megafauna and potentially human civilizations. There is a layer of sediment from this period containing nanodiamonds, melted glass, and other materials consistent with cosmic impact. If this is true, and an advanced Ice Age civilization existed, almost all evidence of it would have been destroyed. Their coastal cities would be underwater now. Their monuments and structures would have been scraped away by glaciers or buried under sediment. Only the most massive stone structures might have survived, and even those might have been weathered beyond recognition or repurposed by later cultures. This theory actually fits some of the evidence we have been discussing. It explains the water erosion on the Sphinx. It explains why structures like Göbekli Tepe appear seemingly out of nowhere with sophisticated design. It explains the global flood myths found in cultures around the world. And it explains how knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and engineering might have appeared in ancient Egypt without a clear evolutionary path, because it was inherited knowledge from an earlier time. Graham Hancock is careful to say he is not claiming this lost civilization was more advanced than us technologically. He is not talking about lasers and flying saucers. He is suggesting they had sophisticated astronomical knowledge, advanced understanding of mathematics and geometry, and construction skills that were later lost. Basically, a Bronze Age-level civilization that existed much earlier than we thought possible. The mainstream response to this theory has been harsh. Archaeologists accuse Hancock of cherry-picking evidence and ignoring data that contradicts his narrative. They point out that we have found plenty of sites from 12,000 years ago, and none of them show evidence of advanced civilization. They argue that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and so far, the evidence is circumstantial at best. But here is what is interesting. Parts of Hancock's theory are being quietly validated. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, which was ridiculed when first proposed, is now accepted by many geologists. Göbekli Tepe, which Hancock pointed to as evidence of sophisticated ancient culture, has forced archaeologists to revise their understanding of what hunter-gatherers were capable of. The timeline keeps getting pushed back. So why do these theories persist? Why do millions of people believe in ancient aliens, Atlantis, or lost civilizations despite the lack of concrete evidence? Partly, it is because the mainstream explanation feels incomplete. When you look at the Great Pyramid, when you really examine what it represents, the official story just does not satisfy. It leaves too many questions unanswered. And humans hate unanswered questions. We would rather have a complete explanation, even a wild one, than live with uncertainty. There is also a psychological appeal to these theories. They suggest that history is not just a linear progression from primitive to advanced. They hint that we might have lost something important, that our ancestors might have known things we have forgotten. There is something romantic about that idea, something that speaks to a deep human feeling that we are disconnected from ancient wisdom. And let us be honest, mainstream archaeology has not always covered itself in glory. There have been cases where establishment scholars dismissed findings that later turned out to be true. There have been discoveries that contradicted accepted timelines and were initially suppressed or ignored. The academic world can be dogmatic, and when people sense that dogmatism, they become more willing to consider alternatives. But here is the thing. Wanting an alternative explanation to be true does not make it true. The burden of proof matters. Extraordinary claims really do require extraordinary evidence. And so far, the extraordinary evidence has not materialized. Does that mean we should dismiss these theories entirely? Not necessarily. They serve a purpose. They push the boundaries of inquiry. They ask uncomfortable questions. Sometimes, the fringe theories of today become the accepted science of tomorrow. Continental drift was considered pseudoscience until it was not. The idea that asteroids could cause mass extinctions was laughed at until evidence proved it happened. The key is to remain skeptical, but open-minded. Evaluate claims based on evidence, not on how exciting they are. Be willing to say, "I do not know," instead of jumping to conclusions. And most importantly, do not let your desire for mystery override your commitment to truth. The pyramids are mysterious enough without aliens or Atlantis. The real story, whatever it turns out to be, is probably stranger and more fascinating than any fiction we could invent. We just have to be patient enough to find it. After wandering through theories about aliens, lost civilizations, and government conspiracies, we need to come back to Earth, literally. Let us talk about what we can actually touch, measure, and verify. Because while the mysteries are real, so is the physical evidence lying in the sand around Giza. In 2017, something remarkable happened that barely made the news. A team of archaeologists working at Hatnub, an alabaster quarry about 10 miles from the Nile, in Egypt's eastern desert, discovered something that changed the conversation about pyramid construction. They found a ramp system, but not just any ramp. This was a steep ramp with stairs carved into it and post holes on both sides, dated to roughly the same period as the Great Pyramid. Here is why this matters. The post holes were not random. They were precisely positioned to hold wooden posts that would support ropes. The system worked like this. Workers at the top of the ramp would pull ropes attached to a sledge carrying massive alabaster blocks, while workers on the sides used the posts as anchoring points, creating a pulley-like advantage. The Anglo-French team that discovered it estimates this system could have allowed a team of just 20 workers to move a 2.5-ton block up a steep incline. This is not theory anymore. This is actual evidence of the Egyptians using sophisticated mechanical advantage systems we had not fully understood before. And the kicker? The inscription at the site mentions that this ramp was built during the reign of Khufu, the exact pharaoh credited with building the Great Pyramid. Now, skeptics will say, sure, but that is a quarry ramp, not proof they used this at Giza. Fair point. But it proves the Egyptians had the engineering knowledge and were actively innovating with ramp systems during exactly the time period when the pyramids were being built. Then there is the discovery that does not get talked about enough: the workers' village. Not just a couple of buildings, but an entire industrial complex covering multiple acres. Mark Lehner's team has been excavating this site since the 1980s, and what they have found is staggering. They found bakeries capable of producing thousands of loaves of bread daily. We are talking industrial-scale food production. They found fish processing areas where Nile perch were being caught, dried, and distributed. They found copper workshops where tools were being manufactured and repaired constantly. The amount of copper slag, the waste product from metalworking, suggests they were going through tools at an incredible rate, exactly what you would expect if thousands of workers were using copper chisels that wore down quickly. But here is the detail that convinced a lot of skeptics. They found cattle bones, lots of them, and not just any cattle. These were young, healthy animals, prime beef. The workers at Giza were eating better than most ancient Egyptians. Chemical analysis of the workers' skeletons from nearby cemeteries confirms this. Their bones show isotopic signatures consistent with a diet rich in meat and fish. This was not a slave workforce being fed scraps. This was a valued, well-fed labor force working on what they probably saw as a sacred national project. The pharaoh was considered a living god, and building his eternal resting place was an honor. These people took pride in their work. You can see it in the graffiti they left inside the pyramid itself, marking their work gangs with names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure. Speaking of graffiti, let us address the controversial quarry marks inside the pyramid. In 1837, Colonel Howard Vyse discovered hieroglyphic inscriptions in the relieving chambers above the king's chamber, including cartouches bearing Khufu's name. These marks have been debated endlessly. Some alternative researchers claim they are forgeries, that Vyse painted them to boost his reputation. But recent analysis using portable X-ray fluorescence has examined the paint used in these marks. The chemical composition matches other Old Kingdom pigments and shows aging consistent with ancient application. More importantly, some of these marks were only discovered after removing stones, meaning they were made during construction on surfaces that were then covered up. You cannot forge something that was hidden for 4,500 years. There is also the matter of the quarries themselves. We can actually see where the pyramid blocks came from. Just south of the pyramids, there are massive limestone quarries with clear evidence of ancient extraction. The geology matches. The tool marks match. We can literally trace the path from quarry to pyramid. For the granite blocks from Aswan, we have similar evidence. The unfinished obelisk at Aswan shows exactly how the Egyptians quarried granite. They would cut trenches around the block they wanted, use dolerite pounding stones to slowly chip away at the rock, and then use wooden wedges to crack it free from the bedrock. It is brutally time-consuming. The unfinished obelisk has been lying there partially quarried for thousands of years because it cracked during extraction and was abandoned. But it is a perfect snapshot of their technique, frozen in time. Now let us talk about some experiments that actually worked. In the 1990s, NOVA, the PBS science program, decided to test pyramid construction theories with actual experiments. They brought in a team of stonemasons, Egyptologists, and engineers to a site near Giza and attempted to quarry, move, and lift limestone blocks using only tools and techniques available to the ancient Egyptians. The results were eye-opening. With copper tools and abrasive sand, they successfully cut and shaped limestone blocks. It was slow. It required constant tool maintenance, but it worked. They moved blocks using wooden sledges and the wet sand technique, and found that it genuinely reduced friction significantly. A dozen men could pull a 2-ton block across wet sand without extraordinary effort. The lifting part was trickier. They built a scaled-down pyramid using ramps and levers, and while it was not easy, they proved it could be done. The key was using multiple techniques in combination: short ramps for the lower levels, internal ramps and levers for higher sections, and a lot of careful planning. Did this prove the pyramids were built this way? No, but it proved that these methods are viable, not just theoretical. The ancient Egyptians could have done it this way, even if we are not sure they did. More recent technology has given us new insights too. In 2015, the Scan Pyramids project used muon radiography, a technique that uses cosmic ray particles to create images of the interior of solid objects. Think of it like an X-ray that can penetrate hundreds of feet of stone. They discovered a large void above the Grand Gallery that nobody knew existed. It is about 100 feet long and has a cross-section similar to the Grand Gallery itself. What is it? Nobody knows yet. It could be a structural feature, an intentional chamber, or just a gap in the construction. The Egyptian authorities have been frustratingly slow to investigate further. But the point is, we are still discovering new things about the pyramids using modern technology. The story is not finished. Another fascinating discovery involves the Tura limestone quarries across the Nile from Giza. This is where the fine white limestone for the outer casing stones came from. Archaeologists have found ancient boat docks, remains of causeways, and logistical infrastructure that shows an organized system for transporting stones across the river. There are even ancient papyrus documents, the Diary of Mirror, discovered in 2013, that describe transporting limestone from Tura to Giza during Khufu's reign. It is a logbook, basically an ancient shipping manifest, that provides a day-by-day account of moving stones for pyramid construction. This is the kind of mundane, bureaucratic evidence that actually proves things happened. It is not exciting like secret chambers or alien artifacts, but it is real. It shows an organized workforce, logistical planning, and administrative record-keeping during the exact time period in question. Then there is the evidence from the pyramid itself. Recent studies of the mortar used between blocks has revealed something interesting. The mortar is not just limestone paste. It is a sophisticated mixture containing gypsum and other materials that made it incredibly strong. Chemical analysis shows it is actually stronger than the limestone blocks themselves in some cases. This was not crude construction. The Egyptians understood material science at a level that surprises modern chemists. The precision of the pyramid is real, but it has also been somewhat exaggerated by enthusiasts. Yes, the alignment to true north is incredibly accurate. Yes, the base is remarkably level, but there are also irregularities. The casing stones, while impressively fitted, are not all perfect. Some blocks have gaps, some have crude repairs. The internal chambers show trial and error. The so-called Queen's Chamber has a floor that is not quite level and a niche that appears to have been modified mid-construction. This is actually reassuring evidence. It shows humans at work, making decisions, adapting on the fly, occasionally making mistakes. A structure built by advanced aliens or lost super technology probably would not have these little imperfections. The archaeological evidence paints a picture of a massive, well-organized construction project undertaken by skilled human workers using sophisticated but entirely terrestrial techniques. They had knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and engineering that was advanced for their time, absolutely. But it was human knowledge, developed through observation, experimentation, and accumulated wisdom. Does this archaeological evidence answer every question about pyramid construction? No. There are still gaps in our understanding. We are still not entirely sure how they lifted the heaviest blocks. We are still debating the exact ramp configuration. We are still puzzled by some of the precision achievements. But the evidence we do have consistently points in one direction. The ancient Egyptians built the pyramids. They had the workforce, the tools, the techniques, and the organizational capability to do it. The mysteries that remain are mysteries of lost knowledge and forgotten methods, not mysteries that require supernatural or extraterrestrial explanations. The real story is impressive enough. A civilization 4,500 years ago, without computers, without modern machinery, without even iron tools, organized tens of thousands of people to build something so precisely and so massively that it has survived virtually intact for millennia. They encoded mathematical knowledge into its design, aligned it to the stars, and created something that still fills us with awe today. That is not aliens. That is not Atlantis. That is humans at their most ambitious and capable. And honestly, that is way more inspiring. So we have established that humans built the pyramids. The evidence is there. The workers existed. The tools have been found. The techniques are viable. Case closed, right? Well, not quite, because even after accepting the human explanation, there are details about the Great Pyramid that still keep engineers and researchers awake at night. Details that do not have good answers, no matter how much we want them to. Let us start with something that sounds boring but is actually mind-blowing. The casing stones. Most of them were stripped away centuries ago to build Cairo, but a few remain at the base of the pyramid, and they are perfect in a way that makes no sense. These are not just smooth stones. We are talking about blocks weighing 15 tons each, with surfaces finished to optical precision. Optical precision means the kind of flatness you find on telescope mirrors or high-end laboratory equipment. Some of these surfaces deviate from perfectly flat by less than 1/100th of an inch across an area of several square feet. To put that in perspective, modern granite countertops are typically finished to within 1/16th of an inch, and we consider that smooth. How do you achieve that without precision measuring instruments? Today, we use laser interferometers and digital calipers to check flatness at that level. The ancient Egyptians had what? Straight edges made of wood or copper. Their most precise measuring tool was probably the cubit rod, basically a ruler. You cannot measure to 1/100th of an inch accuracy with ancient tools. And it is not just one block. It is hundreds of casing stones, all finished to the same extraordinary standard, all fitting together so tightly that the seams are barely visible. The joints between these blocks are not filled with thick mortar to hide imperfections. The mortar layer is often less than 1/50th of an inch thick, thinner than a sheet of paper. That means the blocks themselves had to be shaped with near-perfect accuracy, or they would not fit. Try to imagine the quality control required here. You have thousands of workers cutting and shaping blocks. How do you ensure consistency across millions of stones when every worker has slightly different techniques and tools that wear down at different rates? Modern manufacturing solves this with standardized machinery and computer-controlled tolerances. The Egyptians did it with their eyeballs and hand tools. Some researchers have suggested they used some kind of template system, master blocks that could be checked against to ensure consistency. Maybe. But even with templates, achieving this level of precision across the entire structure requires skills that seem almost superhuman. Now let us talk about those shafts. The so-called air shafts that run from the king's chamber and the queen's chamber at strange angles through the body of the pyramid. Calling them air shafts is probably wrong because they do not actually ventilate anything. The shafts from the queen's chamber do not even reach the chamber. They stop short, sealed by stone doors. Here is what makes them weird. The shafts are precisely angled. The two shafts from the king's chamber point at specific stars. The southern shaft aligns with Orion's belt. The northern shaft aligns with the star Thuban, which was the pole star in ancient Egypt. These are not random tunnels. They were planned, measured, and executed with astronomical purpose. But why? If they are symbolic, why go through the enormous effort of cutting shafts through hundreds of feet of solid stone just for symbolism? If they are functional, what function do they serve? Ventilation does not make sense because the chambers were sealed. Some researchers think they are soul shafts, pathways for the pharaoh's spirit to ascend to the stars. But that is just guessing based on religious texts. We do not actually know. And then there is the mystery of the sealed doors. In 1993, a robot equipped with a camera was sent up the southern shaft from the queen's chamber. It traveled about 200 feet before encountering a small stone door with copper fittings. In 2002, they drilled through it, only to find another door behind it. What is back there? Why seal off a shaft that does not go anywhere? What were they hiding or protecting? The Egyptian authorities have been glacially slow in investigating further. It has been over 20 years since that second door was found, and we still do not have a definitive answer about what is beyond it. Maybe there is nothing. Maybe there is a small chamber with ritual objects. Maybe there is something that would change our understanding of the pyramid's purpose. We just do not know. Then we have the missing mummy problem. The Great Pyramid is supposedly Khufu's tomb. That is the entire justification for its existence, according to mainstream archaeology. But Khufu's mummy has never been found. Not in the king's chamber, not anywhere in the pyramid. The standard explanation is tomb robbers. The pyramid was broken into in ancient times and the mummy was destroyed or stolen. Okay, but here is the thing. The pyramid's entrance was sealed and hidden. The actual entrance was not rediscovered until the 9th century AD, when Caliph al-Mamun's workers tunneled into it. If tomb robbers got in earlier, where is the evidence of their entrance? The passages that al-Mamun broke through were still sealed with granite plugs. How did robbers get past those, and then reseal them perfectly? Some chambers in the pyramid show no evidence of ever being opened before modern times. The relieving chambers above the king's chamber were completely sealed until Howard Vyse blasted his way into them in the 1800s. If the pyramid was robbed, it was a very selective robbery. This has led some researchers to suggest maybe the Great Pyramid was never intended as a tomb at all. Maybe it had some other purpose. But what? Every pyramid in Egypt is associated with a tomb or funerary complex. Why would the biggest one be different? The counter-argument is that the sarcophagus in the king's chamber proves it was a tomb, but that sarcophagus is weird too. It is made of solid granite, slightly too large to fit through the passages leading to the chamber, meaning it had to be placed there during construction. It has no lid, no inscriptions, and shows evidence of being cut with saws that left marks requiring enormous cutting pressure. The lid, if there ever was one, has never been found. Here is another thing that keeps engineers up at night: the Grand Gallery. This is a massive corbelled corridor rising at a 26-degree angle for about 150 feet. Each level of the corbelling overhangs the one below it by a few inches, creating a ceiling that narrows as it rises. It is an architectural masterpiece. But why? The Grand Gallery serves no obvious functional purpose. It is essentially a really fancy hallway leading to the king's chamber. You could achieve the same access with a simple corridor. Why go through the massive effort of creating this elaborate structure? The amount of engineering, the precision required to corbel stones at an angle without them collapsing during construction, it is extraordinary. And it seems excessive if the only purpose is to provide passage. Some theories suggest the Grand Gallery was used during construction, maybe as a counterweight system or a storage area for the granite plugs used to seal the ascending passage. But these are guesses. We do not really know. Then there is the mysterious void discovered by the Scan Pyramids project, that big empty space above the Grand Gallery that we talked about earlier. It has been known since 2017, and as of now, we still have not physically accessed it. Why not? The Egyptian authorities cite conservation concerns. They do not want to damage the pyramid by drilling or tunneling into it. But come on, we have non-destructive robotic technology. We can send fiber optic cameras through tiny holes. The fact that 6 years have passed without a serious attempt to investigate this void is frustrating to everyone who wants answers. What is in there? Is it truly empty? Does it contain artifacts, inscriptions, or structural elements that would explain its purpose? The silence is deafening. And finally, let us talk about the mathematical coincidences that are either proof of genius or the universe messing with us. The Great Pyramid encodes pi, phi, and possibly even the speed of light when you express certain measurements in specific units. Are these intentional? Or are they the inevitable result of working with certain ratios and proportions? The pi ratio is the most accepted. The perimeter of the pyramid divided by twice its height equals pi to a high degree of accuracy. Most researchers think this was intentional, showing the Egyptians understood this ratio even if they did not call it pi. The phi or golden ratio appears in the cross-section of the pyramid. The ratio of the slant height to half the base is very close to phi. This one is more controversial because you can find phi relationships in lots of structures if you look hard enough. It might be intentional, or it might be a consequence of the construction geometry. But then there is the speed of light thing. If you express the pyramid's latitude in decimal degrees, you get 29.9792. The speed of light in a vacuum is 299,792,458 meters per second. The first 6 digits match. Is that intentional? Almost certainly not. It only works if you use modern units, modern coordinate systems, and cherry-pick which digits to compare. It is probably the universe trolling us. But the fact that people can find these relationships at all shows how mathematically sophisticated the structure is. Whether by intention or by the natural elegance of its proportions, the Great Pyramid is full of numerical mysteries that keep mathematicians and mystics equally fascinated. These unsolved mysteries do not prove aliens or Atlantis or any exotic theory, but they do prove that we still have a lot to learn. The Great Pyramid is not a closed book. It is an ongoing investigation, and the final chapter has not been written yet. Every decade brings new technologies that let us see deeper, measure more precisely, and ask better questions. Maybe someday we will have all the answers. Maybe we will figure out exactly how they achieved that precision, what the shafts were really for, what is in that void, and why the mummy is missing. Or maybe the pyramid will keep its secrets a little longer, reminding us that even in our age of technology and information, there are still things we do not fully understand. And honestly, that is kind of beautiful. All right, we have traveled through impossible mathematics, alternative theories, ancient technologies, conspiracy claims, hard archaeological evidence, and lingering mysteries. Now it is time to step back and see the whole picture. What do we actually know? What can we say with confidence? And where does that leave us? Here is what we can state as fact, backed by solid evidence that nobody seriously disputes. The Great Pyramid was built during Egypt's 4th dynasty, sometime around 2500 BC, give or take a few decades. It was constructed primarily of limestone quarried locally from the Giza Plateau, with granite elements brought from Aswan. Tens of thousands of workers were involved, organized into crews and work gangs. These workers were fed, housed, and probably rotated seasonally. They used copper tools, wooden sledges, ropes, and ramps. The structure was aligned with extraordinary precision to the cardinal directions and incorporated sophisticated mathematical relationships in its design. That is the foundation. That stuff is not really debatable anymore. The physical evidence is overwhelming. The workers' village exists. The tools exist. The quarries exist. The administrative records exist. This was a massive human undertaking, and the Egyptians left their fingerprints all over it. But here is where it gets interesting. Accepting the human construction explanation does not actually solve all the problems. It just shifts the questions. Instead of asking, who built this? We are now asking, how did they know to build it this way? And what knowledge did they possess that we have underestimated? Think about the astronomical alignments. The Egyptians clearly had sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. They tracked stars, understood precession, and could predict celestial events with accuracy that rivals early modern astronomy. That is not controversial. But where did that knowledge come from? How did they develop it? Standard historical progression suggests knowledge accumulates gradually. You make observations over generations, you develop instruments, you create mathematical models, and eventually you build up a body of astronomical knowledge. But the astronomical sophistication we see in the 4th dynasty appears without much obvious buildup. It is like they started at level 10 when we expected them to be at level 3. Maybe they did have that gradual development and we just have not found the evidence yet. Ancient papyri are rare. Most have decomposed. The texts we have are probably a tiny fraction of what existed. There could have been astronomical schools, observatories, centuries of accumulated data, all lost to time and decay. Or maybe, and this is where it gets speculative but not crazy, they inherited some of that knowledge from earlier traditions that we do not fully understand yet. Not Atlantis, not aliens. Just older human cultures that made astronomical observations and passed down that information. We know this happens. The Babylonians passed astronomical knowledge to the Greeks. The Islamic scholars preserved Greek and Roman knowledge through the Dark Ages and passed it to medieval Europe. Knowledge transfer across cultures and time periods is normal. Maybe the pyramid builders received a knowledge transfer from an earlier Egyptian tradition or from neighboring cultures that we have not fully excavated yet. The precision mystery falls into the same category. We know they achieved incredible accuracy in cutting and placing stones. We know they had sophisticated quality control. What we do not fully understand is the methodology. What techniques, what tools, what training systems allowed them to maintain that level of precision across millions of blocks? Here's a possibility nobody likes to talk about because it sounds too simple. Maybe they were just really, really good at their jobs. Maybe the master stonecutters of ancient Egypt were virtuosos, people who spent decades perfecting their craft, developing muscle memory and intuition that allowed them to achieve results that seem impossible to us. We have lost those skills. Modern stonemasons use different techniques, different tools. Maybe the ancient methods, practiced obsessively by highly trained specialists, could achieve what seems superhuman to us. Think about master craftspeople in other domains. Medieval violin makers created instruments that modern craftspeople cannot quite replicate despite having better tools and materials. Japanese swordsmiths folded steel in ways that created molecular structures we can analyze but not quite reproduce. Damascus steel was made with techniques that died with their last practitioners. Expertise can look like magic when the knowledge is lost. Maybe pyramid construction was like that. A craft tradition so refined, so perfected, that what they achieved routinely seems impossible to modern engineers who are approaching it from a completely different technological paradigm. Now, does that explain everything? No. It does not explain the sudden appearance of sophisticated architecture without clear predecessors. It does not fully explain the astronomical knowledge. It does not explain why later pyramids were less impressive rather than more. But it does offer a middle ground between primitive people with sticks and rocks and aliens with anti-gravity devices. The middle ground theory goes something like this. The ancient Egyptians were far more sophisticated than we give them credit for. They had accumulated astronomical knowledge over longer periods than we can currently document. They had craft traditions and construction techniques that were highly developed, but used tools and materials that have not survived. They organized labor and resources on a scale that required administrative sophistication we are only now beginning to appreciate through archaeological evidence. And they achieved all of this through human intelligence, human ingenuity, and human persistence. No aliens required. No lost super-civilization required. Just humans being remarkable. But, and this is important, just because we can explain most of it does not mean we should stop asking questions. The unsolved mysteries are not problems with the theory. They are invitations to keep investigating. The sealed shafts need to be explored. The void above the Grand Gallery needs to be examined. The precision techniques need to be reverse-engineered through careful experimentation. The astronomical knowledge needs to be traced back through earlier Egyptian history. Science is not about declaring victory and going home. It is about constantly refining our understanding as new evidence emerges. And with the pyramids, new evidence keeps emerging. Every decade brings discoveries that adjust our understanding, that fill in gaps, that occasionally open up new questions. The story of the Great Pyramid is not finished. It is ongoing. We are still in the middle chapters. And the most exciting part? The tools we have now to investigate, ground-penetrating radar, muon tomography, advanced materials analysis, DNA testing, computational modeling, these tools are orders of magnitude better than what was available even 20 years ago. We are on the verge of answering questions that have puzzled humanity for millennia. But we have to be patient. We have to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it leads to answers that are less exotic than we hoped or more complicated than we expected. The truth about the pyramids is probably not going to be simple. It is not going to be aliens did it or ramps and rope, case closed. It is going to be messy, nuanced, and full of details that require expertise in multiple fields to fully appreciate. It is going to involve lost techniques, forgotten knowledge, human brilliance, and probably some lucky accidents along the way. But that complexity, that messiness, that is what makes it real. That is what makes it human. And that is what makes it worth investigating. So why should you care about a pile of rocks that has been sitting in the desert for 4,500 years? Why does it matter whether the ancient Egyptians used ramps or sound levitation or alien technology? You are not building a pyramid. You are probably not even visiting one anytime soon. What is the point? Here's the point. The Great Pyramid is not just about ancient history. It is a warning label for our entire civilization. Let me explain. We have this assumption, this deeply ingrained belief, that human progress moves in one direction, forward. We assume that knowledge accumulates, that each generation knows more than the last, that we are standing on the shoulders of giants looking ever further into the future. And mostly that is true. We have smartphones, we can edit genes, we have rovers on Mars, we are clearly more technologically advanced than ancient Egypt. But technology and knowledge are not the same thing. And here is the uncomfortable truth that the pyramids force us to confront. Knowledge can be lost. Skills can disappear. Entire bodies of expertise can vanish in a single generation if they are not properly preserved and transmitted. Think about Damascus steel. For centuries, bladesmiths in the Middle East created swords with distinctive wavy patterns and legendary strength. The technique was lost sometime in the 1800s. We can analyze the molecular structure of surviving blades. We can see the carbon nanotubes and cementite nanowires that gave the steel its properties. But we cannot quite replicate the manufacturing process. The knowledge died with the last craftsman who possessed it. Or consider Roman concrete. The Romans built harbors, aqueducts, and buildings using concrete that has lasted 2,000 years. The Pantheon's dome, still standing after nearly 1,900 years, is made of concrete that was poured in a single continuous pour. Modern concrete starts degrading after 50 years. We know Roman concrete used volcanic ash and seawater, but the exact formulation and technique lost for over a millennium. We are only now beginning to figure it out again through reverse engineering. Greek fire, the Byzantine Empire's secret weapon, a flaming liquid that burned on water and could not be extinguished. The formula was so closely guarded that when the empire fell, the knowledge went with it, gone. Historians have theories, but nobody knows for sure what it was. These are not ancient mysteries. These are technological capabilities that existed, that we know existed because we can see the results, but that we cannot reproduce because the knowledge was not preserved. And if it happened to Damascus steel and Roman concrete and Greek fire, it could happen to anything. Now apply that to the pyramids. If the ancient Egyptians had construction techniques, precision methods, or organizational systems that we cannot fully explain, and if those techniques were lost, what does that say about our own knowledge? How much of what we know today is fragile? How much depends on institutional memory, on living practitioners, on unwritten expertise that exists only in the hands and minds of specialists? We live in an age of information abundance. Everything is documented, recorded, backed up in the cloud, right? But is it really? How many of our technologies depend on tacit knowledge, on skills that cannot be fully captured in a manual? How much of our industrial capability requires expertise that is not being passed down because we assume technology will solve everything? The pyramids remind us that civilizations can forget, that sophistication can be lost, that what seems permanent and well-established can disappear surprisingly quickly when conditions change. But there is another reason this matters, and it is more optimistic. The pyramids challenge our assumptions about human potential. They force us to acknowledge that people thousands of years ago, without computers, without modern education systems, without scientific instruments, were capable of achievements that still impress us today. We tend to condescend to the past. We think of ancient people as primitive, limited, less capable than us, but the pyramids say otherwise. They say that human intelligence, creativity, and determination have always been powerful forces. They say that our ancestors were not less than us, just different. They had different tools, different knowledge, but the same fundamental cognitive abilities. That is humbling. It means that if our civilization fell tomorrow, if we lost our technology and had to start over, future humans would still be capable of remarkable things. Not the same things we do now, but things equally impressive in their own context. The pyramids are a mirror. They reflect our assumptions about progress, knowledge, and human capability back at us. And if we look closely, we might not like everything we see, but that discomfort, that uncertainty, that is where growth begins. That is where we start asking better questions about who we are and what we are capable of. So here we are. After diving deep into impossible mathematics, alternative theories, hard evidence, and lingering mysteries, what is the real story behind the Great Pyramid's construction? The honest answer? We do not completely know, and maybe that is exactly how it should be. But here's what we can say with confidence. The Great Pyramid was built by human hands, human ingenuity, and human determination. The workers were real, the tools were real, the organizational capability was real. This was not magic. It was not aliens. It was people, thousands of them, working toward a goal that seemed impossible and achieving it anyway. Yet the more interesting truth is this. The real mystery is not how they built it. We are getting closer to understanding the how every year. New discoveries, new experiments, new technologies are filling in those gaps. Give us another 50 years and we will probably have most of the construction techniques figured out. No, the real mystery is why the knowledge disappeared. How does a civilization achieve something so extraordinary and then lose the ability to do it again? The pyramids that came after Giza were smaller, cruder, less precise. The techniques that created the Great Pyramid, whatever they were, did not get better over time. They faded. They were forgotten. That is the question that should haunt us. Not, how did they do it? But, why did we forget? What happened to that knowledge? Was it deliberately hidden? Did it die with master craftsmen who never trained successors? Did changing political or religious priorities make those skills irrelevant? Did some catastrophe disrupt the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next? We do not know. And that gap in our understanding tells us something profound about the fragility of knowledge itself. It tells us that sophistication does not guarantee continuity. That achievement does not ensure legacy. That the things we build, the things we know, can vanish if we are not careful about how we preserve and pass them forward. The Great Pyramid stands as both a monument to human capability and a warning about human forgetfulness. It is proof that we can achieve the extraordinary and evidence that we can lose the knowledge of how we did it. And that brings us back to where we started. Standing in front of this massive structure, looking up at stones that have been staring at the stars for 45 centuries, asking questions that still do not have complete answers. Maybe that is the point. Maybe the pyramid's greatest gift to us is not the answers it provides, but the questions it forces us to keep asking. Questions about who we were, who we are, and what we are capable of. Questions about knowledge, memory, and the things we take for granted until they are gone. The Great Pyramid is not just a tomb or a monument or a mathematical puzzle. It is a conversation across time. The ancient Egyptians built something that would make future generations stop, look up, and wonder. They succeeded beyond anything they could have imagined. We are still stopping, still looking up, still wondering. So the next time someone tells you they know exactly how the pyramids were built, or that aliens did it, or that it has all been figured out, remember this. The pyramid has stood for 4,500 years, and in all that time, it has never given up all its secrets. It has watched empires rise and fall, seen countless theories come and go, and it is still standing there, still mysterious, still challenging us to think deeper and question more. The Great Pyramid does not care if we figure it out. It will be there long after we are gone, waiting for the next generation to ask the same questions all over again. And maybe, just maybe, that eternal mystery is the most human thing about it. Because if there is one thing humans do better than building monuments, it is asking questions we cannot fully answer. The pyramid just gives us a really good reason to keep asking. If you made it this far, thank you for taking this journey with me. Hit that like button if this changed how you think about ancient history. Subscribe to Tales Before Tesla for more mysteries that make you question everything you thought you knew. And drop a comment telling me what you think. Are the mainstream explanations enough? Or is there still something we are missing? The pyramid is not going anywhere. The questions are not going anywhere. And neither are we. Until next time, keep questioning, keep wondering, and never stop looking up.